Thank you. And thank you all for coming back after last time's technological failure. And indeed, you could say the Titanic was very much a case of hubris for faith in modern technology. But we won't go into that tonight. Tonight, I'm going to talk about Harry Widener, who was one of the victims on Titanic. He was 27 when he died. And one of the big questions about him is what do you do if seem to have a difficulty in moving the slide on. Oh, yes. Right. So what the big question is, what do you do if you need to preserve the memory of someone as a hero of the sinking, if he doesn't quite conform to the heroic image that's expected, in which many of the first-class male passengers on Titanic were depicted as living up to? Now, whether they did or not is another question, because even before the news of the Titanic sinking was confirmed, the newspapers, without any evidence or any eyewitness accounts, were coming up with heroic stories about noble first-class passengers who were behaving as they were expected to. Women and children first was the message of the day. Now, Harry Widener didn't quite fit into that model. He was quiet, he was studious, unassuming. He was a book collector. The Telegraph in London, with an obituary of him, described him as a young Lycidas. This was a very apt literary reference to Milton's poem about another young man who died before he too could live up to his promise. In fact, this young man drowned. So the idea is they're building young Harry Widener up as the equal of Milton's Lycidas. And Milton, for a time, lived in High Holborn and close to Red Lion Square. So there's a nice local connection there for you. But anyway, it was important that Harry Widener be reinvented, and it had to be as a completely new kind of hero. He just was not a man of action, and he didn't fit in to what people expected of a hero. So he couldn't be remembered in the same heroic mould as some of the other men. In fact, this medal very much idealises them almost as Grecian figures. And the sinking was actually on the 15th of April, 1912. But the medal says April the 14th, when the iceberg struck. But I'm sure you didn't have these athletic Grecian figures on Titanic. But they needed to find a new way of commemorating Harry Widener, or at least his grieving family did. And the fact that he was a book collector, came from a wealthy family, but yet was totally unassuming, unpretentious, and didn't put on any airs, meant that he was almost a blank canvas on which they could turn him into whatever they wanted, whatever sort of heroic figure they wanted. And very much he was a graduate of Harvard. He was devoted to his university. On Titanic, he sat up every evening talking about Harvard with an older alumnus, the artist Francis Millett, who also was to perish. And so the important thing was to commemorate him at Harvard, and also to make him into a hero of learning, a man of culture, somebody who wasn't just collecting books to gratify himself, although as you'll see that probably was his motive, but who was going to promote learning for everyone. And indeed, his memorial, the Harry Widener Library was founded and opened in 1915. In fact, the last time I spoke on this to Camden Local Studies and Archives Centre was on the actual anniversary of the opening of the library. Well, in the opening speeches, that the principal of Harvard talked about how Harry Widener was saving European culture and taking it to the New World. And this was in the context of the First World War. So America was seen as the recipient of European culture and its saviour. And Harry Widener suddenly found himself depicted, believed or not, as one of the first Americans to take a part in the war by bringing European culture to Harvard. A bit stretched as an argument, but I think it does show that very much this was a man whose personal modesty allowed him to be easily reinvented. Well, the person who very much was behind this reinvention, and also in the establishment of a library in his memory at Harvard, was his mother, Eleanor Widener. And she plays the central role in it. She seems to have mourned more for her son than for her husband, who also perished on Titanic. And indeed, she met her second husband at the opening of the library in memory of his son, her eldest son, Harry, and then had a very active life as an explorer in the Amazon. Her second husband was an explorer and Harvard academic. And whilst she'd taken an almost overbearing interest in the formation of the library until then, after her marriage, she just forgot about it. She'd commemorated her son, now she could move on. Well, it was thanks to her that Harry is now remembered. His ambition had been to use his wealth to endow a chair of bibliography at Harvard, or else a library. And he wanted to be remembered not for somebody who'd built up a collection of random books, but for somebody who was the founder of an institution. Perhaps he wasn't as modest as all that, but it was his mother who achieved that for him. He left his entire estate, which was considerable, as he came from a very wealthy Philadelphia family. He left it to his mother, not to his father, George, interestingly enough. And he couldn't have known that his father would not outlive him and that his mother would. But this estate was left with the proviso that everything in terms of his book collection should go to Harvard, and that it would be a discrete collection. It wouldn't be spread out amongst the other university books, and it would be known as the Harry Widener collection. Well, his mother went further than that, and she built a whole new library in his memory. In fact, she was compared to Octavia, the sister of Augustus, who had built a library in Rome to commemorate his son, who died at an early age, Marcellus. Harry Widener was described as the new Marcellus. So you've got him being connected with, first of all, Lycidas, a classical figure in a poem by Milton, and also with a Roman young man who was lauded by Virgil and also commemorated by his mourning mother, Octavia. Well, it definitely was his death on Titanic that made Harry into more than a collector of books and into a hero of learning. And this is all tied in with a story about his final hours on Titanic. During his visit to London in March and early April 1912, he bought a considerable number of books, and they were all sent to America in a lead casket on another ship. So his purchases survived him, except for two. One of them was a pocket edition of Francis Bacon's Essaies, a rare 1598 edition, and he bought it from the bookseller Quaritch. Now the firm of Quaritch is based in Bloomsbury, but in 1912 it was in Mayfair. And when he collected his copy of the Essaies, he told Bernard Quaritch not to pack it up with the other books, but that he would take it with him, keep it in his pocket. And he's said to have come out with the prescient words, "I think I'll take that little Bacon with me in my pocket. And if I'm shipwrecked, it will go with me." Well, very poignant story. And indeed, Quaritch was to tell the Times that he was sure that if Harry Widener's body was recovered, he could be identified by a copy of Bacon's Essays tucked into his breast pocket, next to his heart. Now, this is again bringing in another literary reference. Shelley drowned, again like Widener. And when his body was recovered, in his pocket was a copy of the poems of John Keats. So, really, they are building up the myth of Harry Widener as very much a man of letters, in whose death is all connected with literature. He's now a literary hero, a cultural hero. So his manliness is not the same as some of the other victims, conventional type of manliness. This is something that is built on the intellect. Well, the whole story of Bacon was described as the most glorious incident in the romance of book collecting. But I mentioned there was another book that perished with Harry Widener, whose body was never discovered. And this was a last-minute purchase of a 1542 pamphlet on an earthquake at Scarberia. It's even rarer than the Bacon's Essaies. But it doesn't quite fit into the image they're building up. Bacon's Essaies show a man of intellect. An obscure pamphlet on an obscure item of news just doesn't have that same impact. Now, as you'll find out later, it's possible if he did have a book in the pocket of his evening suit, it was likely to be something very different, going by his own personal tastes. But I'll let you think about that for now. So, Widener's very much built up as the picturesque hero. Now, his book collections were very much built up through contact with a lot of the big booksellers of the time. And very much Harry Widener's friends tended to be a lot older than him and tended to be his mentors in book collecting. One of his favourite booksellers was Bernard Quaritch, who, as I say, was based in Mayfair, and the firm is now in Bloomsbury. But also, even more important, was an American bookseller based in Philadelphia, A.S.W. Rosenbach. And very much his fortune was built on patronage from the Wideners, and he advised on what to collect. Well, very much Harry was somebody who, whilst to a lot of people seemed quite remote, standoffish in fact, to the people who shared his interests like Quaritch, he was very amiable and very likeable. His collections at home were stored in his bedroom. And when they were transferred to Harvard, well, it wouldn't have quite been appropriate to reconstruct his bedroom at the centre of a brand new library to commemorate the man. So what was constructed in the Harry Elkins Widener Library as its centrepiece was basically a study. Harry Widener was an Anglophile, so English oak was used. And very much, whilst his library might have been his bedroom, his study and his workshop, what people can see who were admitted into the inner sanctum, it's very much a more conventional but quite opulent study or library, complete with Tiffany lampshades and lamps, and also, by tradition, fresh flowers were placed there every day on the request of his mother. And Harvard legend has it that his favourite flower was the chrysanthemum, and these he would have dyed red, the colour of Harvard, at home. So great was his attachment to his university. You can see the myth building up. Well, this is one of the bedrooms at Linwood, his family home. And his cousin, Peter, described it as a maze of books. In fact, they were piled up everywhere and even tumbling out of the cupboard doors. And there he would entertain visitors. He'd tell them to put out their cigars, because cigars and books don't go together. And he would also entertain them with whiskey and toast. An odd combination. So as you've gathered, he came from a very wealthy family, a family of collectors. His grandfather, Peter Widener, had a very humble beginning as a butcher's boy. He made a fortune by supplying the Unionist armies during the American Civil War, and then he became a pioneer in traction and in transport in Philadelphia, and then widened his interests to railroads and other areas of industry. In fact, he was very much one of the robber barons of the age. And he was even a major investor in the White Star Line and the International Mercantile Company, which was the parent of the White Star Line, which built Titanic. So he had that connection. Now, very much he wanted to be seen as more than a robber baron. He wanted to be seen as a cultural figure, and built a palatial house, Linwood, which was described as the American Versailles, as a home for himself, his two sons, their wives, and his grandchildren. Harry was the eldest grandchild and was said to have been his favourite. The architect of Linwood was Horace Trumbauer, who was later brought in to design the library at Harvard. So, very much they would try and compensate for being nouveau riche by becoming collectors. Peter Widener collected art, and in fact, in many cases, he was duped by the sellers of these works of art. He didn't know anything about painting, so if they told him something was good, something was collectible, something was valuable, he would buy it. And some of the paintings he acquired were worthless. Others were later, in 1942, donated to the National Gallery in Washington, D.C. So they were a mixture. When he thought he was being duped by art dealers, he would become furious. And in fact, his grandson, Harry, often had to calm him down. He was the only one who could. Meanwhile, Eleanor Widener collected silver, and in fact, while she was in London, donated some dishes that had belonged to Nell Gwyn to the newly opened Museum of London. And the second son of Peter Widener, Harry's uncle Joseph, was said to collect everything. So, to distinguish himself, Harry concentrated on books. But the family were not accepted in Philadelphia society. They were new money. And in fact, there's quite a lot of snobbery aimed at them. So Sidney Colvin, who was Professor of Fine Arts at the University of Cambridge, was visited by Harry Widener, who was interested in the works of Robert Louis Stevenson, and Colvin had been a friend of Stevenson's. And he dismissed Harry as a curious young man and said in his features there was the hereditary acuteness of a money-making family of rather low-bred stock. But it was combined with an amiable character and a love of literature. So there's a lot of snobbery there. And a lot of this conspicuous consumption of art in books was in a way to compensate for that. Well, Harry was to meet his death on Titanic. And he showed quite a lot of insouciance about the shipwreck and the collision with the iceberg. In fact, when the collision took place, he was playing poker in the smoking room after a sumptuous dinner with the captain, hosted by his mother, which has almost gone down in the mythology of Titanic. Sort of the last meal, the last great meal. Well, when one of his companions said perhaps they should do something and that there was some danger, Harry's comment was absurd. Now, he had been involved in a previous collision of a White Star liner, the Olympic, with HMS Hawke in the Solent in 1911. And that had just been a minor inconvenience. So perhaps when he said to another friend of his, who suggested that they see if they could get into a lifeboat, he simply said, "I think I'll stick to the big ship, Billy, and take my chance." Billy Carter got into a lifeboat with the chairman of the White Star Line, Bruce Ismay, and survived. But his reputation went downhill, and his wife used it as an excuse to divorce him. So Harry Widener avoided any imputation of cowardice, which gave more acceptance to him. Harry wasn't the only bibliophile to die on Titanic. Another one was Christopher Head. He was the mayor of Chelsea, quite a maverick figure who was interested in public space, in improved housing, and also was an art connoisseur. He was a friend of Kathleen Scott, who produced a sculpture of him, an almost Lucio sculpture with his hands in his pocket. But as well as collecting art, he also was a book collector. And I was actually quite lucky to obtain a book that had belonged to him with his book plate in. So that was a very lucky find for me. But very much for Harry Widener and many of the book collectors on Titanic, they weren't interested in them as anything but something to collect. I think Christopher Head actually was interested in the books he bought. And in fact, some of them ended up at the Chelsea School of Arts, which he had patronised when he was alive as Mayor of Chelsea. But very much book collecting was a form of public consumption, conspicuous consumption. And you could say that a lot of this was down to people who wanted to cut a dash in society. You could compare Harry Widener's book collecting with Victor Panashko. His father had been a scholar. He'd collected books on the history of Madrid, which he, after his death at the age of 32, he donated to the Madrid Public Library. Very good collection. His son, however, eschewed any intellectual activities and was known for his collection of suits. So you could say book collecting was very similar to Victor Panashko collecting fine clothing as a dandy, or Madame Lucille, whose dresses were to be treasured by the people who bought them. She was on Titanic. She later lived in Hampstead. And amongst her patrons were Queen Ina of Spain and Queen Mary when she was Duchess of York. But this clothing was all an example of conspicuous consumption, spending money because you had it, and showing off. Book collecting could be said to be the same. Now, also on board Titanic was one of the most expensively bound books of the time, the Rubaiyat of Omar Khayyam. And it has gone down in legend as almost being cursed. And one reason for the curse is said to be the use of peacock feathers and the depiction of 3 peacocks in the binding. Actually, looking at it these days, you would say it's quite gaudy. And indeed, the Royal Librarian refused to pay the £1,000 that was asked for it because he thought it was ugly. It was bound by the firm of Sangorski and Sutcliffe, a Holborn-based firm of binders. And eventually it was purchased for £450, so a big come down in price, by Gabrielle Weiss, who was an acquaintance of Harry Widener's. In some reports, Widener is said to be taking it back to America for his friend. But that never happened. It's just one of the myths that have grown up based on no evidence. Now, I said the legend is it was cursed. because the book was lost on Titanic. 2 months after the sinking, Francis Sangorski, one of the binders, was drowned on the English coast, and a second version of the book was burnt in the Blitz later on. So it's come to be seen as cursed. Whether or not it is, I'll leave you to decide. So, what did Harry collect? Well, he was very fastidious in what he collected. He only wanted books that were of great interest to him and also aesthetically pleasing to him. So, it wasn't really for their contents, it was for their look. And also if they had a personal connection with the authors or someone with a historical connection. Now, Harry had the money to collect on a wide scale, but people continued to say he was unspoilt by his fortune. And indeed, he lost out on quite a number of sales to other collectors who were wealthier than him, or perhaps more socially and politically important. Well, one person who nominated him for the elitist book collectors club, the Grolier Club in New York, was J.P. Morgan. Again, who was one of the major figures in the financing of Titanic. So there's a lot of irony there. Well, anyway, Harry liked to search for books and he was quite happy to search through a whole pile of books in a shop until he found exactly what he wanted. First editions, books that were connected with famous people, for example, Edward VI's prayer book, and also something that was almost pristine in condition. He liked presentation copies. He began by collecting prints, and that was very much in connection with his involvement in amateur dramatics at Harvard, where he was a member of the Hasty Pudding Club and took part in theatrical performances. So he collected prints really because he was interested in costume to begin with, but then continued to collect them. For example, he collected a lot of prints by the Hampstead-based Kate Greenaway, including not just prints, but also books she'd illustrated. He was also the collector of the prints of George Cruikshank, who lived on Hampstead Road for a time. And then he moved on to books themselves. And it wasn't only just that he had the money to buy these valuable books, but he also had the personality that was determined to get what he wanted, if he could, by his own personality. So very much with fellow book collectors, he was affable, amiable, and tried to get what he wanted. But these books had to be perfect examples, and he liked to collect the best that was available. So, as you can see from his photographs, he was very fastidious in appearance. And that carried on with his collecting. But the thing is, what he collected was very much not a library, not a comprehensive library. It was a collection of about 3,000 individual books that were of interest to him. But people stressed that he had rare judgment when he collected them. And of course, he had to have a Shakespeare first folio, second folio, third folio, like you do. His passion and almost obsession for collecting led his grandfather to say that if he went on as he was doing, he would impoverish the entire family. Hardly likely considering their immense wealth and the fact that the rest of them was as avaricious in what they collected as Harry. But Harry very much liked the modern authors. So he collected the works of Dickens, Thackeray, and he was described as being like an archaeologist digging for Grecian urns. Note, not an archaeologist who was digging to advance knowledge. He was looking for treasures. One of them was the Countess of Pembroke's personal copy of Sir Philip Sidney's Arcadia. Sidney, like Bacon, had been a bencher at Gray's Inn. And the author, Arnold Bennett, described how Harry Widener trustfully allowed him to hold this valued possession. Well, later on, there was some doubt as to the authenticity of the book, but more recent research has suggested that it actually did belong to the Countess of Pembroke. So that was one of Harry's prized possessions, perhaps one of his favourites. But his favourite author was Robert Louis Stevenson. Now, you might ask, did he actually read any of his books? Well, the only book he is known to have read was Treasure Island. He had 37 copies. He claimed to know it by heart, and he never travelled without a copy. So I do wonder whether if he did have a book in his tuxedo pocket on the night of his death, whether it was actually one of his copies of Treasure Island. But he would collect anything he could get that was connected with Robert Louis Stevenson. And he published a catalogue of his collections of the manuscripts and books of Stevenson. And also he'd obtained the manuscript of Stevenson's own memoirs, which he edited and published in a limited edition. So he was already trying to see and portray himself as a scholar. And just before he died, he commented that his father, his grandfather, had actually bought a copy of the Gutenberg Bible, which he would have liked. He wanted it, but his grandfather bought it up. Now, later it was said that he was going to give it to Harry on his return to America, but that was not to be, and we'll never know if that's true. But Harry wished it was for him. Well, Harry also prided himself on his memory. And he said that he would never take notes on anything, but instead he would remember, because he might easily lose a piece of paper, but he would never lose what was in his head. He also memorised and knew the names of actors in all the plays he'd been to, and the baseball scores and averages of players. So very much he prided himself on his memory. Well, after his death, his library was completed for him by his mother. As he left it, it wasn't a comprehensive library. It was incomplete. So booksellers advised Eleanor Widener on what he would have wanted to own, how he would have wanted to be seen as a book collector, and what should be in the library of every young scholar. So it was in their interest to do that. She's paying a fortune to complete his library. But I think one almost sad and almost pathetic piece is in a letter. She said that the first Christmas after his death, she'd placed all his books, ones that had been brought to him, in his bedroom, just as she'd always done. So that does humanise the man. But very much he was to be seen as having a story of lost promise. This was a man who would have built up a great library if he'd had time to do it. And so he was resurrected and revived after death, very much as the scholarly hero. A hero not of physical activity like the other heroes in tuxedos on Titanic, but as a man who was a hero for his intellectual attainment. His sister commissioned a stained glass window in his memory from Tiffany, and the stained glass window appropriately shows St. John the Evangelist holding his copy of his Gospel. And somehow you can see this is a depiction of Harry Widener. He's almost sanctified by his collection. And I think the important thing is this is somebody who perhaps was greater through his death than he ever could have been in life at all if he had lived. So thank you for your attention. And I hope we've covered a lot and you haven't been disappointed after the failure and hubris of modern technology last time. So thank you.
Well, I'd just like to thank Kevin for that wonderful, wonderful talk. And I think possibly pass over to my colleague Ruth, who's going to take any questions. So everyone's got 1 minute to just have a think about what they'd like to ask about what they've just seen. And hello, Ruth. Hello.
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 That was fantastic. Thank you very much, Kevin.
Thank you.
Yes, there's some quite interesting names that come up and some spellings of or names that I'm not familiar with, and some spellings like the Hampstead bookseller. Was it Sangorski and
Sangorski and Sutcliffe, they were the bookbinders.
Yeah.
In Holborn.
Right. And then there was a bookseller or public?
Rosenbach was in Philadelphia.
I see, right. But there was someone in Hampstead as well.
Kate Greenaway.
Oh yes, obviously, yes, Kate Greenaway. Yeah.
And George Cruikshank lived in
Hampstead Road.
Road,
Yes.
who I'm sure you've covered in
Oh
your...
yes, David saying about Lady Lucille.
Oh, this was Madame Lucille, Duff Gordon. She was a dress designer, and she ended up her life living in Hampstead towards the end of her life.
Right. Okay, so shall I move on to some other people who might like to ask a question? Anybody? I'm sure there must be.
There are a couple of messages.
Oh, messages, right.
Anne-Marie would just like to say thank you, great talk. And Francesco says thank you, very interesting. But for some reason, they don't want to speak out loud. So.
Okay, right. So anyone else like to say anything while we're still connected?
The other one of the great
Jonathan?
directors who went down with the Titanic. The other great one was Solomon Guggenheim, whose family founded the Guggenheim Museum.
Yes, Benjamin Guggenheim was one of the victims, and his daughter founded the Peggy Guggenheim collection in Venice.
Did you hear what New York first?
Well, they were from New York, and her museum is now in Venice.
Could I ask something?
Oh, hello, Hazel.
Ruth. Hello, Ruth. Could I ask Kevin to tell us something about his research? How did you go about your research to get all that information?
I looked at newspaper accounts. I looked at the published catalogues, obituaries, some of the correspondence of the various individuals, and also looked at the overall picture of what was going on. Mm-hmm. So there's quite a lot of archival research involved.
Yes.
And the use of primary sources.
Didn't involve going to the United States?
Well, actually, in some cases, because of the interest in Titanic, some of papers in the National Archives and also in Halifax, Nova Scotia, so in Canada, have all been digitised these days. So you can actually read them in the original format, but images of them.
Yes.
So whereas once it would have been essential to go to the United States, now it's a lot easier.
You can sit at home, yes.
Although there's not that much fun. It's much better actually going and seeing the originals. And also there's material in the Public Records Office, the National Archives here in London.
Oh, thank you.
Thank you very much. Now, Andy, would you like to unmute yourself? You're wanting to ask a question?
Yes, please. Thank you. Kevin, just for our amusement, can you tell us about the swimming test? Go on, and whether there's anything at all behind it.
Well, Harvard legend has it that there was a swimming test for undergraduates. They had to be able to swim a length. Now, there does seem to have been a stipulation at various times, but it's been linked in with a stipulation from Eleanor Widener, who had the idea that his son couldn't swim. If he'd been able to swim, he would have survived. Now, putting aside the fact that it's unlikely he would have survived because he wouldn't have been able to swim far enough before the cold got to him. And hypothermia was what killed most of them. We don't know in his case because his body was never recovered. And there's one eyewitness account which is contradicted by other people, that he was close to where one of the funnels collapsed, so there could have been injuries. But anyway, there seems to be no truth in this legend that she'd insisted all undergraduates learn to swim. And in fact, as far as we know, Harry could swim. At Linwood, there was a swimming pool. So that's just a nice little story that's grown up in later years. And there's also a story that undergraduates were given free ice cream because it was his favourite dessert. And I think that's as likely as the chrysanthemums painted red, which I mentioned in the talk.
Lovely, thank you very much.
Thank you. Any more questions?
Did I get it right, Kevin, that his mother was on board, but she
His mother was on board but survived.
Yeah.
But his father was, and he died.
Mm-hmm.
His mother's maid survived, but his father's valet was another one of the casualties.
Mm.
And he was London-born.
Okay, I think on that note, do you think we can wrap things up? Oh, is that somebody waving a hand about? On Andrew Jones? No. Okay, well, thank you very, very much to Kevin and also to Lindsay for keeping this particular ship afloat. And and I'm sorry in a way that we had a slightly smaller audience, but I'm sure that we can all join in thanking Kevin very much for his talk.
Yes.
Thank you.
Yes.
Thank you.
Well done.